Good morning everyone and welcome to the Guild of Agricultural Journalists of Ireland Climate Literacy Seminar. Climate change is part and parcel of our daily work lives, be it a story we're writing or a communications campaign that we're working on. The agriculture sector is set to have to reduce emissions by between 21 and 30% by 2030, and carbon budgets for every sector of the economy will be announced shortly. On top of that, there are many claims and targets out there from companies, be it planting trees to offset carbon footprints, to setting targets to reach net zero or become carbon neutral by a certain date. In this context, journalism and PR have never been more important as we navigate our way through these claims, targets, budgets and terminology. We as communicators will be scrutinised in our handling of this. At today's event, sponsored by Board BIA and Danone Ireland with support from the RDS, Independent Sustainability Advisor Ali Sheridan will deliver a guest lecture which will bring us through the state of sustainability, what we need to be looking at going forward and the questions that we should be asking. After that, we're going to move to a panel discussion where we will speak to Zoe Kavanagh, CEO of the National Dairy Council, Dr. David Robbins, Assistant Professor at the School of Communications at DCU, and Ali. We welcome your questions for the panel, so please get in touch through Slido, and I'd now like to welcome Ali Sheridan to deliver the guest lecture.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for having me here today. It is, of course, a pity we can't be together in person, but it's great to see so many of you joining us virtually. And I also want to say well done to the Guild for making climate and sustainability the theme of today's event, because I'm sure as we're increasingly aware, the climate crisis is the biggest issue of our time. So I'm someone who has worked in sustainability my entire career. I started with NGOs, but very quickly realised that industry and business has a lot of work to do in terms of responding to the climate crisis, but also had a real opportunity to drive change through innovation, new thinking, collaboration, and moving at pace. And I became really interested in the food sector and was lucky enough to spend many years with Board BIA, initially as one of the Origin Green ambassadors, where I was seconded to PepsiCo to work on carbon methodologies and the Sustainable Agriculture Initiative to work on farmer engagement, and then as sustainability manager with Board BIA, working to scale the Origin Green programme, weaving in more sustainability criteria, looking at the quality assurance schemes and bringing in retailers and food service. And I saw firsthand the very real efforts that were being made across the value chain, the pressures that were growing from a number of different drivers on the food industry, but also a lot of the challenges that had yet to be truly addressed with the pace and ambition required, which we're starting to understand much more of today. I then had an opportunity to work with IKEA for a number of years, an example of a company that has to completely rewrite what it does and redesign now for a climate-safe future. You won't be buying your single-use furniture anymore. You'll be buying solar panels, you'll be leasing furniture, getting your furniture fixed. So over my career, I've seen the corporate sustainability agenda completely shift. What we thought was leading practice just a few years ago, we realise now was just scratching the surface. And one thing we can't get away from is that this transition, this climate era we are in, is going to be difficult and complex. So today we're going to try and make a bit more sense of it. And for me, I always come from a point of empathy on this. Everyone is struggling with this agenda, every industry, every company. So today isn't about pointing fingers or trying to stress you out about how much more you need to do. It's about setting out the state of play and hopefully giving you some good insights and some good tools to move forward, more empowered to drive change, whether that's from positions within organisations or from the outside asking questions. So this morning, we're going to look at where we are with sustainability. What are the different drivers that are putting so much attention on the issue? What are the kind of responses that we're starting to see from industry at the moment? We're going to look a little bit closer at where the gaps are, maybe some of the red flags. And then I'm going to leave you with a bit of a checklist of what's left to do and some questions to take forward into your own work. And just to say, we will be sharing these slides with you as well as a resource sheet with an explainer of all the key terms and questions that you should be asking. So no need to be frantically writing things down. You can sit back and listen in instead. So before we start looking at the more traditional drivers of corporate sustainability, we have to acknowledge the scale of the crisis we are in. I imagine that at some point over the last year, something has made you sit up and pay more attention to climate issues. It might have been the recent IPCC Code Red for Humanity report, which showed us that at a time where we know we need to strive to keep global temperature rise under 1.5 degrees to ensure a safe future, we have already pushed them up by over 1.1 degrees, and we're starting to see the impacts of that increase all around the world. Or you might have been keeping an eye on the news or been in contact with family and friends around the world, and you'll have seen the severe flooding across Central Europe, across India, across the States, wildfires in California and Greece, continued drought across Africa and Asia, huge destruction, showing us how vulnerable our infrastructure is, homes being lost, livelihoods being lost, lives being lost. And we have to remember that everything we have built as a society, our plans for the future, our dreams for the future, are all dependent on the assumption that our climate remains stable. But that's an assurance that's starting to run out. And I think sometimes in Ireland we tend to feel slightly immune to the impacts of climate change, but that's not something we can really feel much longer. We know Ireland is already locked into a certain amount of climate change, and we're starting to see the impact of that around the country. Our coastal regions are coming under severe pressure from sea level rise and coastal erosion. Our homes and land are being lost. Infrastructure like our railways starting to be impacted. More extreme flooding happening more frequently, and more frequent and longer spells of drought. We have to start asking ourselves, how resilient are we to climate change? How prepared is our infrastructure, our agricultural sector, our insurance sector? So as an island nation in particular, we have to move very quickly now to adapt to the changes in climate we know are coming and move much faster to mitigate any further worsening of these impacts. And when we talk a lot about emissions as the key metric of climate change, we also have to acknowledge the wider impacts on our natural world that we are also in a biodiversity crisis. And when it comes to Ireland, the metrics are pretty shocking. The recent EPA State of the Environment or State of the Irish Environment report showed us that our climate metrics are still going the wrong way. Greenhouse gas emissions are rising, our sea levels are rising, our temperatures are rising, our air quality is worsening. 1,300 people in Ireland prematurely dying because of air quality. Our water quality is worsening with severe declines in pristine river sites. And probably most concerning is the state of our biodiversity. We continue to lose habitats and species at pace. All indicators that our natural world is under intense pressure because of how we are doing things, and sending us a very clear signal that we need to change our approach very rapidly. And when it comes to emissions, we now find ourselves at a really difficult point of time, where we have to achieve the most ambitious reduction in the shortest amount of time that we've ever attempted. So if we're striving to stay within that 1.5 degree ceiling, the ceiling that scientists tell us gives us the best chance of a safe and stable future, this is what the trajectory looks like, this green line. A sharp, rapid, sustained drop in emissions. This means at least 7% reduction in emissions every year. And if you consider that during COVID and lockdown with all its blunt measures and forced restrictions only got us about a 4 to 6% reduction, and that those emissions are already creeping back up as we reopen, you start to get a sense of just how big this challenge is. So this is no longer about incremental initiatives, about recycling, keep cups, or even EVs. This is fundamentally changing how we do everything. This is about recognizing that our world has planetary limits that we cannot breach. And it's this transformative mindset that we're going to need if we're going to close the emissions gap. So what's driving business sustainability? I suppose it's fair to say that business hasn't always responded to the science with the urgency required, but there are a range of other drivers that are putting real pressure on industry now to take more climate action. So we know that there is a growing appetite from customers and consumers, particularly our younger consumers, for sustainable products and alternatives. We see lots of anecdotal evidence that consumers are consistently becoming more interested in living more sustainable lives. We see sustainable living as one of the top Pinterest trends. Over lockdown, when people had a little bit more time, we saw the searches for how to live a more sustainable life increase by more than 4,500%. And we know that consumers are looking for companies and brands to provide solutions to help them live more sustainably and to align with their values. But even more interestingly is the customers, the B2B customers, who are now leaning very heavily on suppliers to provide sustainability solutions. That might be about providing new sustainable alternatives to existing products, or what we're starting to see more of now is suppliers being asked to do more of the heavy lifting when it comes to reducing emissions for end consumers to help them achieve their own sustainability goals. So we're starting to see a lot of the bigger companies in particular launch supplier sustainability programs and set stricter procurement criteria to help drive suppliers forward and take climate action. And the supply chain. We know the supply chain and its vulnerabilities and volatilities is a key driver of corporate sustainability. We know supply chains today are under pressure from a mix of Brexit impacts, the knock-on effects from the Ever Given incident, and the impact of COVID as well. But climate change is going to bring a whole new level of volatility and uncertainty to supply chains in the coming years. We've seen glimpses of our vulnerability in Ireland with weather extremes like Storm Ophelia and our infamous bread shortage. We see coffee prices today jumping due to a severe frost that has threatened the crop. We see the impacts of recent extreme flooding that they've had on farmers across Europe and their harvests. But as a country who operates within a very globalised supply chain, we are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, both home and abroad. How prepared are we for higher frequency of flooding and drought across our agricultural production systems? What are the resilient measures in place? How exposed are we if we're not going to be able to access raw material inputs that we depend on, such as feed, because of worsening climate change in other parts of the world? And we also have to look at employees really starting to put companies under pressure and who want to see real change. You know, we saw the walkout from Amazon workers demanding publicly, marching for climate action, demanding their company does more. Here in Ireland, we see an increasing number of professions self-organising around climate, coming together to push their industries to do more. Groups like Architects Declare, a group who knows that their work is heavily linked with more carbon, whether that's through construction or the use of steel and cement. Purpose Disruptors, a group who work together around the creative industry who want to do change. And Irish Doctors for the Environment, an industry who know they're going to be directly impacted by climate change, their jobs made harder, coming together to demand more action from their employees and from their industry. So employees want to be part of the solution, not the problem. And corporate sustainability is now very much both a talent attraction and retention issue. But employees are seeing through the fluffy CSR, through the beach cleans, through the lunch and learns. They want real action and they want opportunities to play a direct role in driving that change. And we're also seeing an increasing amount of climate litigation move through the courts. We now have over 1,900 cases that have moved through, taking companies and taking governments to task on their inaction to date. We saw the examples like in the Netherlands of the Uganda case, the government brought to court for its not having enough ambition around climate. We saw a similar case in Ireland with the Climate Case Ireland, the successful campaign, looking at our mitigation plan and the courts agreeing that it was not ambitious enough. And most recently in companies, we saw the Shell case, again, having set out their strategy, still not enough in terms of what the science is saying. So precedent has been set, and companies and countries are increasingly going to be held to account for their inaction in the courts. And greenwashing. Similarly, we are starting to see a crackdown on greenwashing. Companies making sustainability claims that they can't hold up. An example recently in the UK of Ryanair talking about being, an efficient and an effective airline, but really not taking into account their absolute impact in terms of carbon emissions. H&M, another example from Norway, talking about the credentials of a very small part of their business. Well, great to see, again, not indicative of their entire impact. And recently in the UK, we've seen the launch of the Green Claims Code, starting to bring some structure and definitions to how we use terminology around sustainability, ensuring that any claims are truthful and accurate, they're unambiguous, they're not limiting or hiding important information, that they're only making comparisons that are fair and meaningful, that they consider the full life cycle of a product, not just one tiny part of it, and that they're substantiated. And investors. Probably the fastest growing driver of corporate sustainability at the moment is investors, or the ESG agenda. So ESG is environmental, social and governance, and it's the approach that the investment community uses when assessing companies or industries in terms of how at risk they are from climate change and how well prepared they are to transition. So while ESG is still finding its way in terms of what constitutes a green definition or not, for example, we have examples like tobacco companies scoring quite highly because they're growing the crop sustainably, but obviously ignoring the S part, the social impacts of the product. There is a lot of movement now towards science-based, proven impact. So for example, we've seen in recent days companies, renewable energy companies depending on biomass, dropped off ESG indexes because again, when we're looking into biomass, when we're looking at the full life cycle, the climate maths isn't adding up like we thought it would. And from a risk point of view, investors are now looking at companies in terms of their physical risks. So how prepared are they for that extreme weather, for flooding, for droughts, but also the transitional risks. How quickly are they responding to policy? How quickly are they responding to consumer shifts as well? And increasingly, we're going to see any finance that's given to industries directly linked to the achievement of positive climate outcomes. And of course, a driver many of you within organisations will be familiar with, disclosure and reporting. So over the last few years, as the demand for more companies to share what they're doing in terms of sustainability has grown, so has the number of reporting and disclosure frameworks. And the reporting landscape is very busy, lots of different platforms available, but the key trend to note is that it's becoming more standardised and more mandatory. So the EU is now looking set to introduce a mandatory corporate sustainability reporting directive in the near future, which many more European companies will have to share details of their impacts in a way that can be compared between company A and company B. But it's also worth noting with disclosure that while it's a necessary step in terms of getting a hold on where companies are having impact, it's not action. And we have a situation at the moment where organisations are rated based on their disclosure activities and their plans, but not on their actual action, which is something we need to keep an eye on moving forward. And of course, regulation and policy, with so much happening in this space at the moment. So we're building on 2015, the big year of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, it was a good start getting the community, the international community, to agree. But we know that what was agreed in Paris gets us nowhere near that 1.5 degree ceiling. So now we have the EU setting a goal to reduce emissions as a bloc by 55% by 2030. That's up from the original target of 40%, a big jump. And we have the European Green Deal now trying to weave climate through every part of its operations. So we see in finance now a new taxonomy definition of what is a sustainable development. We have that mandatory corporate reporting regime coming into play, the common agricultural policy, a shift to circularity, the right to repair. So really starting to implement sustainability from all sides. And obviously we have a very important few weeks ahead, COP26, the follow-up to Paris. So each country has to bring their national determined contribution, their national climate plan to this meeting. And we're really going to get a sense of where the level of ambition is at for the next decade in particular. We're also going to be looking at climate finance. How willing are we in the global north to support the global south in terms of moving quicker to sustainability and not becoming as dependent on fossil fuels as we were? And it's going to be a real litmus test for where we are in terms of global ambition and, more importantly, commitment to driving change. And here at home, we have a very few busy weeks ahead of us as well. We have our climate bill in place that sets out a 51% reduction by 2030. In the coming days, we'll get our climate budget, which will set out the limits on our greenhouse gas emissions that the country as a whole cannot breach. We're going to get two budgets up to 2030, one for 21 to 25 and the next for 25 to 2030. And then we're going to get to the sectoral roadmaps where we're going to see what each sector, what cut of the emissions pie are they going to be asked to take. So we need to get an average annual reduction of 7%, but we might see lower reductions apply in the earlier years and action then ramped up in the second half or so to make up the shortfall. It can't be underestimated what this will mean for our society. Reducing emissions by 51% is a huge task that will require a huge amount of change and ambition. In the coming weeks and months, we will start to understand the types of actions each industry will be asked to do. And importantly, it will be a real litmus test of how committed each industry is to doing their fair share. So, with the science becoming clearer and those other drivers starting to apply more pressure, what kind of response have we started to see from industry? So when we look back on the evolution of corporate sustainability, we can see that it began very much from a resource efficiency point of view, looking at those measures that typically save money as well. Then we moved into CSR, which brought in the social side of sustainability, being a good neighbour in your community, looking at human rights in your supply chain. To now the triple bottom line, which is a concept that we still see, I suppose, championed in terms of where business should go. And while it's a good theory, you know, we're trying to get to that sweet spot in the middle where we can balance economics with protecting the environment and the society, we know that it hasn't worked. What we've ended up with is companies talking a strong game around sustainability, but really not leaning into those environmental and the society needs. And we've got a lot of business as usual, just a little bit greener. So now what we know we have to do is move away from business being something that just exists for profit, move away from trying to balance business and profit with social and environmental needs, because we have to realise that business needs to operate in a way that helps to achieve positive and social outcomes, and importantly operates within planetary boundaries. Because the planet will go on fine without businesses, but businesses cannot survive without a stable, safe climate. So what we're hearing now and we're seeing is a big move to net zero. More and more, day after day, net zero announcements being made by countries and companies. And I suppose this is the kind of language and ambition that we've been waiting to hear. You know, this move away from kind of random incremental targets to now seeing companies mapping out how we're going to reduce emissions, staying within those planetary limits. And we're also seeing a welcome move from organisations to taking account of their entire supply chain in terms of impact. So when we talk about emissions, we can break them down into 3 scopes, 1, 2 and 3. And traditionally, companies just looked at their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So if you imagine, for example, a retailer, those are the emissions that might occur in their directly owned shops or offices, their energy use, their waste, their water use. And then their scope 2 is the impact of the energy that they're purchasing. But the real impact typically comes from scope 3 emissions, those emissions that occur in the wider supply chain. These include upstream activities such as what's happening in suppliers' factories, on farms, logistics, and downstream, things like consumer behaviour or where money is being invested. And for too long, companies in their sustainability strategies really only looked at scope 1 and 2, but we're finally starting to see a big shift to scope 3. And the reason they're so important is that they contribute to a large majority of emissions for many industries. For example, if you look at the last 3 bars on the right, you can see that the scope 3 emissions make up 90% of FMCG emissions, 85% of fashion emissions, and 83% of food emissions. So the role of primary producers and suppliers is so important in getting emissions down. And companies have largely left this out. It's hard, it's complex to gather this data, it's hard to support the entire supply chain, but this is the complexity we have to lean into now. And this is the time, we have no more time to delay action. We have to get working to change these emissions. We're also seeing a move to science-based targets. So not setting targets that we know we can achieve or that won't push us too far. Targets that are in line with the science, not incremental. And these including scope 1, 2 and 3. And in Ireland, we've seen a growth in the number of companies that are setting these targets. We have 32 companies committed to setting science-based targets. 16 of those companies have had their targets accepted, and 5 of those are in the food and drink industry. And it's worth noting that even with the science-based targets, the goalposts keep moving in terms of what is good enough. So those companies that would have set targets a number of years ago would have been working to a 2-degree trajectory. Now they have to work to a 1.5 degree. So again, as we understand the science, we realise that the ambition has to grow. And then in terms of strategies, we're really starting to see the language and ambition change. So one of the standout strategies over the last 18 months was Microsoft, talking about being carbon negative, taking out more carbon from the atmosphere than they produce. Talking about their historical emissions. Companies didn't just start emitting yesterday. How are we going to be responsible for everything we've emitted to date? And finance. This is going to be expensive. It's going to need investment and resources. And Microsoft putting $1 billion into their climate fund. We've seen Marks and Spencer's in the last few weeks rehash their Plan A strategy, which was a standout strategy at the time. Now going for net zero across scope 3 emissions by 2040. Their scope 3 is 95% of their emissions. They need to lean into it. We're also seeing them use loyalty programs to try and encourage customers towards more sustainable behaviours, partnering with innovative startups and looking at employee initiatives as well to get every employee working towards the cause. We're also seeing a shift to net zero by 2050 commitments from Danone and Mars. So Mars looking at working across their entire supply chain, engaging 20,000 suppliers with in-depth decarbonisation measures, building detailed product level carbon footprints and setting an internal price on carbon, really important, helping those within the company navigate that tension between traditional business outcomes and now having to take carbon and putting a price on it so that it's part of the decision process. And this is the Co-op from the UK, their 10-point plan on climate, looking at everything from decarbonisation to how they're going to advocate publicly for more climate action, how they're going to invest sustainably as well. So really a much more holistic view. And we're seeing this increase in shift as well in terms of the link between sustainability and governance within organisations. So we're starting to see roles linked now to those traditional performance metrics, but also positive climate outcomes as well. Starting to see the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer, move into the CEO role as well. Starting to understand that sustainability isn't a side-on, it's central to the DNA of organisations going forward. And a shift to new models, lots of talk about regenerative agriculture. How can we figure out how to move to models that benefit our climate, that sequester more carbon for us while trying to produce quality food within the planetary limits? Looking at the circular economy as well, how can we stop the linear production model, keep everything that's out there in production, stop our need to taking virgin natural resources? And eco-labels, carbon is becoming the new calorie. So we would have seen eco-labels trialled maybe 15 years ago and they didn't scale at the time. Data wasn't there, the consumer maybe wasn't ready. But that's rapidly starting to change. So we have trials happening within companies such as Compass. We have trials happening at an EU level, at a UK level as well. Companies and industries and governments now feeling that the consumer is ready to be able to pick up the product and compare product A and B and make their decisions based on sustainability and climate action. And the shift to new business models like B Corps, who really putting sustainability central to their organisation, looking at it from a holistic point of view, yes, the environmental criteria, but also the governance within the organisation. How are workers being treated? How are they being empowered to be part of the change? What does the engagement with the community look like as well? And customers, how can we help them enhance their sustainability behaviour? And even bringing in a legal entity to this, that the company exists beyond just serving profit and traditional shareholders, and now looking towards serving the environment as well. And technology, I think it's fair to say that the pace of change, we underestimated it sometimes. So if you take the example of the ICE or the EV trend, we know that companies were making commitments around moving away from traditional car making by 2030, then it was 2028, and now Honda is making that commitment by 2022. We've seen the price of solar plummet as well. So we need to learn lessons about where the public, consumers and regulators are on climate and prepare to move much faster in terms of industries around energy, food and fashion. So it's fair to say the response from industry has really started to change in terms of the level of ambition, the scope of what's being looked at, and that longer-term business model transition that needs to happen. However, there is a but. While we undoubtedly have more focus on corporate sustainability, more strategies than ever, more talk and dialogue on the issue, we always have to look at the metrics that matter, the emissions, the biodiversity, the social outcomes, and we are not yet seeing enough proof that real impact is happening. So when we look deeper into these strategies and reports, we tend to find a lot of the same issues. So for example, this is a report from Climate Action 100, an investor initiative designed to hold companies to account on their climate commitments. They found in a study of over 150 of the world's biggest emitting companies that none of the companies have fully disclosed how they were going to achieve net zero. So they had the end goal, but not the detail of how they were going to do it. Only half of the commitments didn't include the full scope of emissions. So again, not really looking at the entire supply chain, where that impact is happening. We have to lean in and get that data and lean into the complexity of trying to improve the situation. No company had put enough capital up to make this transition happen. We can't talk about it if we're not going to resource it. We won't be able to get it done. And only a third had linked executive pay to climate outcomes. So again, trying to navigate that tension between traditional business outcomes and now those planetary limits, having to reward people within organisations for doing the right thing. We also have issues with the language being used, I suppose. And your resource sheet will give you a much longer list of definitions, but just to take a few examples. When companies talk about carbon or climate, when they talk about net zero carbon or carbon neutral, sometimes they're only talking about carbon dioxide. But climate targets typically include the 7 greenhouse gases, so that includes methane and other gases as well. However, the terms are being used interchangeably by companies and countries, so it's always worth clarifying what does the target cover, just emissions or carbon dioxide equivalent, which is those 7 gases. When we talk about net zero, it's that balancing of emissions that are being emitted and how they're being offset. But net zero is also called carbon neutral, GHG neutral, net zero GHG, climate neutral. And then we have carbon negative. So this is the aim of trying to take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than is emitted. And just to be increasingly complex, carbon negative can also be called carbon positive or climate positive if a company is using it in the sense that they're being carbon positive by being carbon negative, by taking out emissions. So it's not straightforward, and it's always worth probing what exactly is the target referring to and the language that's being used. So when we look at net zero targets then, we know we have a few issues in terms of what they're saying. We have companies using a mix of absolute and intensity targets. So when we're looking again with a planetary limits point of view, the need to get emissions down. When we look solely at emissions from a unit point of view, whether that's a litre of milk, a kilogram of beef or whatever it is, it's not giving us the full picture. Because even though that unit might be getting more efficient, if the company is continuing to grow and scale, the overall absolute emissions are going up. And we know we need to change that trend. So we need much more focus on absolute emission reduction. We have companies using different scopes across different geographies. So it's really hard to understand what's happening in the supply chain. What are the areas that are not being addressed? For example, if it's a global company and we're not hearing much around the countries that the supply chain, that's supplying from, we need more detail. We need to understand where those hotspots are and what's being done about it. 2050 targets. So if the end goal is 2050, what are the interim targets that we need to see? We can't push everything beyond 2040. What is the goal going to be from now to 2030? What part of the effort is going to happen between 2030 and 2040? We need to understand that roadmap more clearly. And technological optimism. So things like carbon capture storage being talked about a lot. Technology that will help us suck emissions out. Fantastic if we can get it to scale and get it to work for us, but we don't have enough certainty of it at the moment. So to have strategies that are leaning on technological solutions probably later into that 2050 timeline is risky. We need to understand how emissions reductions happen today, and then should those technological become scalable, they'll play a role, but they can't be everything we're depending on in terms of effort. Offsets. We've seen a huge rush on offsets as companies grapple to move towards net zero, so trying to find ways to balance out your emissions. But we have a few issues with offsets as well. We're seeing offsets being used a lot to offset emissions rather than reduce them. So to typically allow business as usual, buy up as many offsets as possible, but that misses the point. We have to get absolute emissions down. Also questions about the performance of offsets. They're quite new in terms of a solution. We don't fully know how they perform. Do they really sequester as much carbon as we hope they do? Are we putting too much optimism on what they're able to achieve? There's not enough land to go around. If every company's solution to this is just to offset their business, we literally do not have enough land to use for things like afforestation initiatives. We also have to think about the ethical issues. How ethical is it for us here in the global north to continue our way of living, to continue our level of growth, and just buy up our offsets in areas like the global south? How fair is that to their development and in terms of the global citizen approach to sustainability? And probably the most dangerous element of offsets is that it allows business as usual thinking. It convinces us that we can buy ourselves out of this, and we can't. We need to unlock transitional, transformative mindsets, and depending on offsets, prevent us from doing that. So we need to look much more critically about how they're being used and making sure that they're not just balancing business as usual, but there's other efforts going on to reduce absolute emissions. And lobbying, we can't get away from it. We have a lot of organisations publicly speaking out and putting up their net zero strategies, but then behind closed doors lobbying against measures that would help us get there. So for example, around issues like carbon tax, where do companies stand on it? If they're talking about an ambitious net zero strategy, but then lobbying against a measure that will get us there, we have to ask questions about speaking out of both sides of their mouth and whether a company is truly committed to this transition. And delayism. So we know that we don't have so much issue anymore with climate denial, but we know that climate delay is the new big issue. So that can take lots of forms. It can talk about whataboutery. What about China? What about data centres? What about other regions? Why do we have to do it? But that misses the point that we're all facing into the same storm, that any action that we don't take lessens our resilience to climate change. And it misses the point that, we haven't just started emitting yesterday. We've been emitting for decades, and we have a responsibility to lead here and to show others how it's done. Also, individualism. We know that too much pressure has been put on the individual to make changes here when we haven't given them the solutions to do so. And organisations have a real opportunity now to empower millions of consumers around the world to make every choice a sustainable choice and really unlock that collective behaviour that will help us close the gap. And then, like I say, technological optimism as well. Too much hope on what might or might not come into play in future decades, and too big of a risk to take in terms of delaying our action until that technology is scalable. We have to act today. So there's no doubt we're starting to move in the right direction, but there's still a way to go before we see an adequate response. We always have to remember the context in which we're operating. We are in a climate crisis, and we are running out of time. Our emissions are still increasing, and we're getting closer and closer to breaching planetary boundaries. And if we do that, our chances of staying within that 1.5 degree ceiling are near impossible. So our focus has to be on rapid, absolute emission reduction. Incremental, bit-by-bit behaviour won't get us there. And we know that what was agreed in Paris wasn't enough. We are hearing what's going to be agreed at Glasgow, but it's looking like it's not going to be enough. So there's still a big ambition gap to close. So we have to push for more details about how we're going to get there, more ambition in terms of the metrics that we're setting for ourselves. And if we look again at Ireland's emissions profile, if you look at that bar on the left, that's our activity today. And we have to squeeze all of that into that yellow box by 2030, into that yellow dot by 2050. So yes, we can be looking at restoring some of our carbon sinks, looking at planting forests, but we still have to dramatically reduce emissions, and it is going to change literally how we do everything. So in the coming weeks as well, we're going to see hopefully a tool that will help companies. We're going to also see the new climate action plan, which will detail what Ireland's plan and roadmap looks like. We're going to see the sectoral emission ceilings and the outputs from COP, which will give us an idea of how ambitious that journey will be and who is doing what. And next week, we're also going to see the launch of the first net zero standard from the Science Based Target Initiative. And as mentioned earlier, we're also going to see mandatory reporting for our bigger companies. I see other jurisdictions like the UK now calling for companies to provide the detail of those net zero roadmaps. So if we take, for example, this new net zero standard, it's going to have to be independently verified. Companies are going to have to set out how they're going to decarbonise 90 to 95%. They're only going to be able to rely on a 5 to 10% offset regime, and also pushing companies to be more active, go beyond even what's been asked of them today, taking into account those legacy emissions. So moving forward, well, we covered a lot today. There's some key questions you should keep in mind when you're working within organisations or you're reading press releases to try and get to the detail of what's being talked about. So if we look at emissions, are the targets absolute or intensity? If we're talking about an intensity unit based, can the company tell us when they're going to achieve an absolute reduction? Are the targets science based? Are they doing enough to reflect that 1.5 degree trajectory? Are scope 3 emissions covered? It's not enough to look at scope 1 and 2, particularly in agriculture. What's happening in the supply chain to improve performance? What is the net zero target year? Is it 2050? Is that enough in terms of ambition? And what are those 2030 and 2040 interim targets? How are offsets being used? Are they going to reduce overall emissions, or are they there to allow business as usual? How much of the emission reduction efforts will occur before 2030? So how much of the effort are we front loading? We're not delaying for the next generations. What baseline is the company using? Is it a baseline a year that was particularly high in emissions that might make the trajectory more simple? Or is it reflective of the business performance and the level of ambition necessary? And is the company addressing historical emissions, emissions that they've put out over the last few decades that we didn't have to respond to at the time? Risk. Has the company completed a climate risk assessment? How are they proposing to manage risks such as drought, disruption to raw material? If the company is talking about carbon leakage and its fear of carbon leakage, where is the data to substantiate that claim? Is the company publicly disclosing its climate impacts, its risks, its targets and its progress? What frameworks are they using, or are we only hearing part of the story? Are disclosures independently verified and audited? And is the company publicly supporting mandatory disclosure standards to help level that playing field? And then from an advocacy point of view, really important for organisations now, is the organisation publicly advocating for more progressive climate action? Are they lobbying for or against measures? Are they putting out that strategy but lobbying against the measures that are going to get us there? Are the trade associations they're part of also advocating for climate action? Does the company have a plan around its investments and its finance as well, where a huge amount of impact can happen? And governance. So how is the company going to get this done? Is there an internal sustainability and climate action team? How resourced are they? Do they have the necessary skills? Are we seeing that linkage between performance and climate positive outcomes being shown in the company? What about the board? Have they got climate training? Do they have the right climate expertise? Are they using an internal carbon price? And how do they really engage employees on this issue, help them become part of the solution? And fairness, justice, something we don't talk enough about in terms of net zero strategies. Is the company planning its transition in a timely manner that reflects the science? Have they looked at the entire supply chain impacts? How are they going to support suppliers with this transition, support the local communities, the customers and consumers that depend on them? Have they looked at the wider environmental impacts? So if you remember, this isn't just about emissions, it's about our natural world as well. What's their dependence on the natural environment in terms of their operations, and what is their impact? What are the metrics they're using to make sure they're not having a negative impact on the environment? Are they using biodiversity experts and scientists to support them on that? And if they are using tools like offsets, have they looked at them from a biodiversity and a climate justice point of view as well? So there's lots to be thinking about as you're working with companies or writing about them in the coming weeks and months. But as a final note, the key question to ask is whether the company or industry is actually doing or delaying when it comes to climate action. Again, coming back to the context of the crisis we are in, we have to remember that disclosure is not action. A report and strategy is just the start, but where is the proof of impact? We have to remember that any progress is not enough. Progress has to be in line with what the science says. It has to reflect the industry's impact on the climate and environment and not just be a little more sustainable. And importantly, we have to remember there is a very real cost to inaction. Who is going to pay the price of delaying action today? Is it future generations who will be left to pick up the pieces? Is it employees and suppliers who will be left behind if their industry doesn't plan a timely transition? Delaying climate action isn't a neutral act. It comes with a very real price. So we have to challenge those who might want to delay action to explain how they're going to protect future generations or their industry from inevitable climate impacts. And while I'm under no illusions of the very real challenges that are ahead, the tough decisions that have to be made, the complex work that has to happen, we have to do this, and we have to do it quickly because we are running out of time. And it is all of our responsibilities to push for more ambition, to work together, to ask better questions. Climate action won't happen unless each and every one of us plays a part in making it happen. So I hope I've given you some clarity of the state of play with corporate sustainability, some of the positive moves we're starting to see, but also some of the key areas and gaps we need to address now moving forward. Looking forward to answering some of your questions on the panel, but please do connect or reach out if you need any further help, because like I say, we'll only get there if we get there together. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ali, for what was a very detailed and comprehensive lecture, and something that will be up on the Guild website later on. We're joined now by Zoe Kavanagh, CEO of the NDC, and Dr. David Robbins, Assistant Professor of Communications at DCU, and also Ali again on our panel discussion here. We're going to go through some questions. And Zoe, I might start with you. So you're on the front line, I suppose. What's your experience on the front line, I suppose, defending some of those claims in the dairy industry? Defending the dairy industry, I suppose, with all the claims that are levelled against it, and of course, more work coming down the line in terms of emissions and reducing those emissions.
Yeah, the challenge here is really weighing up both the opportunity, because there is an opportunity if we get this right, with the threat, and it's almost, as Ali said, the threat of inaction. And what we've got, which is really interesting when it comes to Irish dairy, is an assessment between the tension of the nutritional contribution of the dairy product portfolio to population health and the environmental impact of producing that. And I think if you look to the starting point, back in Paris, it was agreed that in the pursuit of climate mitigation plans, we should not compromise food production. And the key consideration for Irish dairy is how do we get the balance right between providing global dairy off a grass-based system at half the global average of emissions and yet meet our targets nationally. So we need to reconcile the nutritional contribution with the environmental impact, and we need to deliver on our national ambition and targets while doing the right thing globally. And I keep bringing this back to the 3 Bs. We have buoyant global demand for Irish dairy. We have a production system due to geographical location and the pasture-based system, which is better than most other geographies in the world. And obviously the climate mitigation plan is to produce dairy in the best suited place. So that's thinking globally, but nationally, we've been tasked now with an ambition which we must deliver against. And you talk about businesses. When it comes to Irish dairy, we have 17,000 businesses, because each dairy family is a business of itself operating within a rural community that absolutely needs to do the right thing. So inaction isn't an option. The action plan has been mapped out. We've identified what's going to bring about an improved Irish dairy system, moving towards net zero. And I think the big challenge now is pace of progress and rate of adoption among the Irish dairy farmers. And then perhaps from a consumer perspective, the challenge is on one level, back to nutrition and environment, the consumer's attitude towards the product portfolio has never been higher. And there has been a COVID impact in terms of consumers returning to trusted products. However, the consumer attitude towards the production system actually is in decline. And we need to address that through this climate literacy theme. So it is around clear communication to the consumers around exactly what's happening on Irish dairy farms and the proof points that will earn the trust at the point of purchase.
And who should do that? Who should deliver that communication between the dairy farmer and the consumer? Is it the media? Is it farm organisations? Is it yourselves? Is it dairy farmers themselves? How would you go about doing that?
So we all have a duty of responsibility, not just in the communication, but also in the doing. Certainly for ourselves within the National Dairy Council, our agenda domestically is that we sit between sector and Irish public. So we have an obligation to have a two-way communication back into the sector around consumers' expectations, but also to the consumer around what the sector is doing. And one of the key challenges we've identified is the language we're using. And just to illustrate that, we have farmers acutely aware that, by way of example, low emission slurry spreading is a really important component to bring about change and to lower emissions. That conversation in the consumer's world or with the Irish public is not a very palatable conversation. So one of the things we need to do is develop language that doesn't divorce itself from the proof points and the action, but communicate in a way that the consumer can relate to. And one of the things I've been testing with the Irish public is almost drawing a parallel between Irish dairy farming and gardening.
Okay.
Soil management, applying the right amount of water, applying the right amount of plant food. And we all know we've got, those best-in-class gardeners, probably our mothers, and then us trying to emulate that in a good or a bad way. And I don't mean to be flippant, but we've got to find a way of communicating that people can relate to, because as you've just heard from Ali's presentation, this is complex. It's hard to get your head around. And when you look, each sector has a responsibility to deliver change, but society also has a responsibility to bring about change. And I think we need to simplify the action plan at a societal level and at a sector level, that people really understand the behavioural change, both in terms of on farm, but also how we live. So I see that as a big challenge. And you say the who of it, obviously, as I say, us, the National Dairy Council, along with Irish dairy farmers, along with Board BIA, we all have a duty of responsibility to communicate the action plan, but we must be honest, transparent and authentic in how we do that.
And I think I'm going to move on, but I do think you can nearly have a whole event on that topic alone. Zoe, I might move to you, David. You were obviously in with RT and in with the Irish Examiner on climate change, basically, and climate change reporting. What can you tell our journalists and members and PR communicators in terms of reporting on climate change? What advice have you for them in their day-to-day work that they can be applying? And I suppose, what do you see as the main challenge to applying that then further on?
I might deal with the challenges first, because I think it's important to kind of look at it from a journalist's point of view. And it's a very, very difficult story to cover from a journalist's point of view. It's very complicated. It's, we look at the typical classic story for a journalist is something like a murder. It's a discrete one-off event. It has a victim. It has, possibly it has narrative, it has drama, and all the rest of it. Journalism in general is very bad at slow-moving, long-term trends like poverty or, domestic violence or climate change. So something that is just somebody said climate change as a story doesn't break, it oozes. So it happens over a long time frame. It also is, as I said, it's covering so many different scientific disciplines. Another challenge for journalists is actually interviewing scientists, because scientists talk a different language to journalists. and they talk about risk and probability in a way that journalists find it hard to communicate clearly about. So I think we got to acknowledge that it's a tough story for journalists to cover. In terms of what I could say about them trying to cover it better, is we talked a little bit about, should there be a sustainability question in every interview, no matter what the context? You know,
It's an interesting way of putting it.
I was talking about my wife, who happens to work on the culture section of the Sunday Independent, and her journalists are now asking in every interview, no matter film star, author, what's your take on climate change, and getting some great kind of great quotes. But there were a couple of things, trying to let climate not be siloed into, say, environment correspondent. It's different in agricultural journalism because it does go into nearly every speciality of the different, cattle, sheep, machinery, everything. So it's not such a problem in agriculture and journalism, but in mainstream news journalism, it tends to be siloed. I think it's a good idea to try and seed it across the whole newsroom in every aspect of journalism. Try to just, I suppose, the main message I was giving both RTE and the Examiner was, news journalism has a strong pull to do things the way we always did them. You know, how did we cover the last COP? How did we cover Paris? How did we cover the last carbon budget? There's a feeling of, let's get out last year's paper or look at last year's plan and say, okay, you're going to do that this time. That's a huge, I was trying to get them to say, okay, pause a minute, think. You don't always have to cover it the way you reflexively, your newsroom culture is set up for you to cover it. You don't have to say, what's this going to cost? That's the one we always go to first. You don't always have to cover it. Are the Greens getting one up on Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, or are they getting one up on the Greens? So we tend to cover it in two ways. One is what's it going to cost the punter, and two is basically the political infighting. And even at EU level, we'll cover those policy debates as like a boxing match or a horse race. So my main message to them was, there's loads of other ways to cover this. There's opportunities. There are ways in through intersectional lenses like diversity and class, and there's all sorts of ways to tell this story, and that they should just pause and not just do the thing they automatically do all the time.
Okay, and just to go back on one of your comments there, you're basically saying everyone in a newsroom should be a climate expert, or have at least a really good bank of knowledge there, so that they can cover it.
Yeah. I think there was this piece in a journalism research institute in the States saying, if you're not a climate reporter now, you soon will be. So it is going to affect every news beat, every specialism. So I think the whole idea of environmental literacy and carbon literacy is so important for journalists. And there's some research of the general public that, they don't talk about climate change so much to their mates because they're a little embarrassed that they mightn't have got the basics right the first time round, and it's a bit late now to kind of put your hand up and say, hold on, could you explain that to me again? So they're a little embarrassed, a little bit wary. So climate literacy, carbon literacy around, what Ali was talking about, all the terminology around sustainability is really, really important. And I should have said at the outset, I think it's great. Your Guild is doing stuff, the Examiner is doing stuff, RTE is doing some stuff. Journalists want to, they want to deepen and strengthen their coverage of this topic. Yeah,
totally. Ali, I might move on to you, back to you even. I suppose how do you handle, or how do we handle all the different voices? Environmentalists, farmers, consumers. Everyone, there's a lot of voices in the climate change sphere, and people say farmers or other people in other sectors should do this. Why aren't they doing this, and what are they doing? How would you handle that?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most important conversations we have. What we really don't want is a repeat of, if you remember when sustainability was building up before Brexit came and took all our attention, the finger pointing, right? The getting industries to task against each other. We know it won't work, it won't get us where we need to get to, but equally, we know everyone has an opinion now on sustainability, and whether we admit it or not, everyone has their bias, whether that's their industry, whether that's the education they've had, their day-to-day. We all see and interact with sustainability and climate action issues in our own way. But the challenge now for the storytellers is to find that balance and to take that independent point of view. So for me, it's a lot of fact-checking, a lot more fact-checking that's going on. And I get that this is complex, this is my day-to-day, and I find it extremely complex, but it's around pushing further for where our figures came from, our stats came from. Are they up to date? Who else rolls in behind them? Are they just one study that happened 10 years ago that we're still talking about? Like, we've really got to dig a little bit deeper into the proof points, like you say, and make sure that they back it up. Equally, it's about getting those voices that you're not hearing. So if you're getting a lot of the same message in agreement, typically I like to challenge that. Who's not speaking up then? Go and seek at them. I think a lot of the point, when we're making sustainability strategies, what we've learned is that we have to go and seek those voices who maybe aren't part of the conversation to get the fuller picture of what's really happening in terms of impact or not happening. And then really it's just around, I suppose, understanding that, while we've got, I would say differing views, but people's own version of views or what they see, it's having empathy for their situation, understanding the realities, but trying to bring in that balance of voice. And then most importantly, being led by the science. We can talk about all the efforts that we're making and the initiatives that we're doing and the pledges that we're signing up to, but we look at the EPA reports, we look at the IPCC reports, and it's not adding up. So if we're going to tell a story about progress, it has to be within that lens of the climate science, and if they're mismatching, then we have to tell a deeper story. So I think it's not going to be an easy way to navigate. I think journalists and even those within organisations are going to have to get more comfortable at asking better questions. I think you'll find the answers aren't always there. People aren't used to being asking that level of questioning. Sometimes the data isn't there yet, but that's what we need to find out. Why isn't it there? How do we get it? How do we make better decisions? Asking a lot more questions, getting a balance of voice, but always being led by the science.
I think that's critical in everything going forward as well, especially in agriculture as well, in terms of measures coming down the road, that science is there. Science is there to either say yes or no, this will work or this won't work, or this is what we don't need to do. And I suppose, Zoe, I might come back to you. Obviously, last Saturday, the news broke that 21 to 30% is likely the reduction that agriculture is going to have to cut emissions by 2030. As CEO of the NDC, what did you make of that?
It's going to be a big challenge, but it's not beyond possibility to achieve. But what's required now is, I think we've had a good demonstration, certainly over the past 2 years, of leaders, your top 10% showing the way and identifying either through biodiversity measures or through nutrient management measures what can be achieved, what the impact is, actually in many cases what the cost benefit is. But where we need to get to now is, if we are to deliver those targets, we can't just hold up the top 10% as sort of, here's our proof point. The proof point has to flow all the way down to all the 17,000 enterprises. And I think where we've got to now with the farming community is a high level of awareness that this is a priority. And now it's around all of sector, all of the participants within the sector, motivating, encouraging a higher rate of adoption. And I think if that happens, the targets will be achieved. The challenge in agriculture, and I do come back to the environmental impact versus the nutritional contribution, this is not a factory with an on-off switch. You're working with nature. And in working with nature, it's going to take time to see, the fruits of this labour of change. But it's possible. And we are gifted with natural resources that can facilitate, a really good outcome. I mean, I keep saying to the sector, set ourselves the lofty ambition of being the best small dairy producer in the world. And it is possible, but it can't just be something delivered by, as I say, the top 10% or the top 20%. This is all of sector and all the moving parts of sector doing the right thing. So it's a challenge, but we all have to play our part. And it's not just agriculture. I know there's a feeling that agriculture is always the poster child when it comes to Ireland and emissions and climate change. It's not just about emissions. You know, Ali talked about the biodiversity and the habitats, and that has to be a key part. So I think it is achievable. The big frustration within the sector is there's a cost to doing this, and then there's this irritant around, you know, will society or will that consumer pay? And I think there's two ways of looking at this. One is actually this is now an expectation of staying in the food business. This is an expectation. But I think at a consumer level, doing the right thing and showing that it's a premium product produced in a responsible way with a sustainable future, actually earn the right to command a premium and go after that. And I was, you know, involved in a group yesterday saying, view this as the brand building opportunity for Irish dairy. You won't get your premium tomorrow, but you probably will get your premium in 2030. You will be rewarded for this. But this isn't an a la carte choice. This is a mandate, and we have to deliver. And I think there's been a big debate, but I think the sector is ready to accept the challenge. It's a resilient sector. It's a sector that's shown change. So I'm confident that we'll get there.
There might be a comment there that some people might say that 2030 is a long time to be waiting for a premium, but again, that's an interesting comment as well. I'll keep moving. David, I suppose Zoe mentioned the word awareness there, and that's, you know, there's climate change channels now coming on board. There's, you know, specific sectors on certain websites that are climate crises. Are there any great examples of those, you know, taking those on board, I suppose, that we could all use? And looking forward, where do you see that climate coverage being in 5 years' time? I originally was going to say 10, but that's too far away.
There's a couple of things happening, you know, just in talking to people covering climate change in Ireland, in the UK, in the US. So the journalists are moving away from the hearing both sides, you know, the kind of, somebody says something, well, I'll go and interview somebody who disagrees. So they're moving more into weight of evidence reporting and trained judgment. These are kind of things that they're coming into their work. In terms of like a good example, I think the Bloomberg Green is a really good initiative of the Bloomberg Financial News Service. I think they do good in-depth stuff, and they're employing another kind of process that a lot of climate journalists do, which is this kind of, it's called in the literature radical transparency, but transparency, making the agenda of the people who are in your stories transparent, but also being transparent about your own reporting processes. So everything is out in the open, if you know what I mean. I'm making it clear where this organisation is coming from, where that organisation is coming from, and where I'm coming from. So they're the kind of processes that are starting to be seen. Where it's going to be in 5 years' time, there's two scenarios. One is where there's mini specialisms. So you'll have like an energy correspondent, and you might have a kind of urban climate correspondent, and into the different type of constituent elements of climate change is one scenario. And the other scenario is everyone's a climate change reporter. So it either goes more specialist, or just that everybody is kind of doing a bit of it. And
to put you on the spot, which do you think is more likely?
I think the more specialist one is probably it will probably end up being a bit of both, that everybody will have a little bit of climate change coverage in their area, but we're going to see more. It's going to require a little more expertise in particular areas around energy systems, agricultural systems, transport systems, that your general environment correspondent won't be able to cover all that.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from people watching now. And I suppose this is from Katrina Morrissey, news editor at the Irish Farmers Journal. It's to you, David, and Zoe, you get to come in on it too. As a former journalist, how would David advise journalists to deal with an onslaught of social media after reporting factual information on climate and farming?
Yeah, God, Katrina, that's a great question. And did a piece of work there where he interviewed about 15 environmental correspondents around the world, and they all spoke about the toxicity of social media around this. And one of the interviewees talked about how people don't understand about journalism. You know, that just because you report that somebody said something doesn't mean you're agreeing with them. It's just part of your job to inform the public that this is what they say. So you get it in the neck for doing that. Maybe from the environmental side, maybe you get criticised because you quoted somebody who they don't like, and on the other side you get it from the more delay deny side, that you're covering this at all, or you're covering climate action. So there isn't an easy answer to that, Katrina. I wish there was. One of the Irish interviewees said, look, it's par for the course, and you just kind of, you know, block, ignore, carry on, report where it gets crosses a line. But they all say it just comes with the territory.
But there is a part to that, though, that I'm pretty sure 99% of the people that tweet this at journalists or whatever for reporting, they're hardly going to say it to your face if you saw them in the street either. Like I think there's a veil there that it's very easy to hide behind, and to just shout on social media where you're, you know, who's holding you to account, who's holding that person to account. I suppose there's that line of it as well.
There is, and I was just reading something that the BBC did, Panorama did a big thing on online abuse of journalists. They set up a couple of dummy accounts. Obviously, women are much more targeted than men, but they tracked down some of the trolls, some of the anonymous trolls, and confronted them. And they were apologetic to a certain degree, but still thought this was just part of robust discourse, shall we say. So, right. Look, there's no easy answer to that question.
Zoe, how would you take that question?
It's a timely question, because I even had experience of this particular issue yesterday. And what I find fascinating is there's a real presumption of agenda bias when someone reports. And it's either, you know, at what you were saying earlier, David, around being transparent around where people are coming from, the journalist, perhaps the corporate if they're involved, and you know, the other elements. But there is this presumption that you report facts, and to your point, Ali, we now are in a situation where facts and science should be, you know, fundamental to what's reported. But if, for example, the facts have been assembled through an organisation that seemed to be private versus public, you know, NGOs are great at almost park the facts and now let's do a finger wag at private enterprise, like as if there's a presumption that there is an agenda and an ambition to distort what's true. And, you know, we're talking here about the need for society to urgently address, you know, keeping the planet safe in the longer term. You know, that is the holistic ambition. And I think we need to move past, you know, sector versus sector, public versus private, NGO versus other organisations, and deal with the facts and the science and ensure that we are all doing the right thing to get the right outcome. So I think the attacks on social media, you know, post-interview, post-report, is a total distraction. It's like, let's get back to the facts and let's get back to the, you know, pursuing the right course of action. And I think we need to be much more consistent in calling that out, rather than suggesting there are, you know, dark forces at work or individuals aligning themselves with dark forces. Because if we stick to the facts and that checking that you were talking about and are aligned around the proof points, you know, a lot of this bad behaviour should be stamped out. Because the worst thing that could happen is if we have a fear among, you know, media and journalists in reporting, and we almost get it to a suppressed society. none of us want to end up in that place.
Yeah, no, totally. Ali, I don't know if you want to come in on that one. Obviously putting you on the spot a bit now.
No, I just I think it's a very timely observation. You know, I'm an avid user of social media myself. I find it has many benefits in terms of things I've learned as well, but you can very clearly see it getting more tense, and I imagine more scary for a lot of people in this space. Like, I'd like to see, similar to kind of COVID fact checking, where we have the support of technology companies helping to filter through some of the content. And I do think we need to be really careful. This climate action is an emotional issue. It's going to challenge us all. It's going to, you know, we're going to have to change how we do things. We're going to have to reflect on how we've lived and decisions that we've made. And it's not an easy topic, right? So it's natural we have kind of diverse stances on it and heated conversation, because people are obviously driven by panic, by, you know, fear of what's ahead, and want an urgency and appetite to do something. So I wouldn't want to see any shutting down of conversation. I think we really need to protect that two-way dialogue, and we need to move to a much deeper democratic dialogue as a nation as we move forward to what's ahead. But I do think, you know, we have a responsibility to call this out behaviour as well. I think sometimes, whether it's the Irish way or not, we kind of, oh, it's going on, and, you know, until it gets too bad, and then we've lost control of it. We need to, you know, support each other on that call out. It's not about opinions versus your, you know, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and they'll have their different backing to that. But where it's behaviour that is primarily targeted at shutting someone's down opinion, you know, very clearly we do need to address it and get ahead of it, hopefully before, because we're only at the very beginning of this conversation. I think sometimes this feels like the hard part, but this is the easy part. This is going to get tougher for us, and so we need to protect those platforms, protect the ability to have a conversation, and maintain, hopefully, what is a positive relationship. Yes, we'll challenge each other. Yes, we'll hold each other to account, because otherwise this is, you know, this is going to get harder, and we're all going to pay the cost of not staying on top of it. So,
we're going to take one more question before we wrap up today, because I'm just conscious of time, and it's for Ali and David and Zoe. Feel free to come in on it if you feel it. So are large corporations guilty of hiding behind taking mitigation measures without making a proper effort to reduce emissions, particularly in the energy sector? And that's from Phelim O'Neill, also of the Farmers Journal. For you, Ali.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's not just the energy sector. I think this applies to all sectors. We've two things happening. We have a situation where there is a little panic in terms of industry and corporate response to sustainability. Yes, we've been hearing about it. Yes, we've known policy and stuff is coming, but we haven't been preparing correctly for the scale of the transition. And now, with the rapidly increasing focus, a much more informed public, much more accountability coming to the fore, companies are rushing to get out strategies. And again, this is worlds away from CSR. You're not going to get a net zero strategy by employee engagement initiatives or supporting the local charity. You know, this is getting to your core of your business and rewriting it. And that is so hard. It's really, really difficult. And so for some companies, what we see is trying to, I suppose, get that last squeeze out of those more digestible measures, maybe like the mitigation measures. But what we know is that the data isn't backing that up in terms of the real change that has to happen. So what we need to see now is much more detail in those net zero strategies, much more transparency year to year of the progress that's happening, highlighting where there's inaction and why and what they're going to do about it. But then on the other side, we do have some bad faith actors who are getting into that delay stage. So that's the big thing we need to be careful now. It's not so much climate denialism, it's climate delay. So if we've got organisations, industries, sectors looking to push action post-2030, waiting for better science, waiting for better technology, we don't have time, unfortunately, for that anymore. Maybe they'll come into play, and that's great, but we have to act today. So we need to differentiate between the two. I think companies will start to understand who's really committed and who's more into that delay factor in the coming months, particularly from an Irish perspective. And that's where we need to start asking questions for the detail. What's in that roadmap? How much of that is it going to deliver? How much can you prove that that's going to deliver? If we're talking about the future technologies, the future innovations, that maybe, is that good enough? Is that a risk we're willing to take? It's not a risk I'd be willing to take in terms of my kids' futures. So I think we really need to understand, understand where companies are coming from, but look for that detail in those future plans, and that's where we'll start to differentiate between commitment and delayism. But it's like you're saying, journalists are struggling with this issue. People within organisations are struggling with this issue. Even the sustainability people. It is a complex, excuse the pun, but meaty issue that needs a lot of expertise, completely different mindsets, shifting of resources. So I can have empathy with organisations for where they are and industries, but we rapidly need to get moving now. And like I say, looking for that detail, the proof, and always the science.
I might just do one quick fire question to each of you before we finish up. David, if you had one key message, and the same question for Zoe and Ali, one key message as a takeaway for journalists and communicators today.
Yeah, my key message would be, remember what journalism is for. It's for informing the public, being a watchdog, and holding authorities and bodies to account. So if you kind of keep steering towards those goals, you have to interrogate all sides in this arena, and if you kind of have your public in the back of your mind as who you're doing this for, I think you can't go far wrong.
Zoe?
Yeah, I just hang it on one word, which is authenticity. There is no room for misleading when it comes to this challenge, and I think faithful reporting and authentic proof points from those who are responsible to show the way. I think that's vital when it comes to this particular challenge. Ali?
Yeah, I just say, the position of being able to tell the public the story on this is a privileged position. And I think it's going to be a really increasingly important role. So there's a big choice to make here, to start leaning into the complexity, getting more brave and courageous with asking those questions, or risk being complicit in our inaction. And it's really difficult. We're all there, whether journalists or other professions. So it's time to look at that now and decide what side you're going to go on. If that means becoming more climate literate and getting the skills, then that's what it means. It's getting that education. But continuing the way we've continued with not giving full stories, maybe not being brave or courageous enough with questions, is not going to help us moving forward. So we're really going to need journalism to acknowledge that privilege and help us all understand what that future vision looks like.
Okay, I think there's a lot to wade through there from everything that's said. I'd like to thank our panel of Ali Sheridan, Zoe Kavanagh and David Robbins for joining us today for what was a very comprehensive lecture and discussion on reporting climate change. The recording will be available online along with a resource that Ali has put together, and Bord Bia and Danone Ireland have also provided case studies and research on their sustainability work. This will also be available on our website. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Bord Bia, Danone Ireland and the RDS for having us here today. And that's it for today, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we can all get together soon.